So today we're going to talk about this, we're going to call it the parable of the sisters. It's not really a parable, but it kind of uses some illustration of these two sisters that are identified in Israel and speaks to them directly. So we were going to do this last week, but we ran out of time. So we're going to start with this idea of the sisters in Ezekiel. Do you guys know what this is? Have you ever heard this before? Have you ever heard of the sisters in Ezekiel? Probably not. Nobody really reads this and is like, this is one I memorized, to wanna. It's not really one of those. But there's a couple things to note. So you remember Ezekiel 16? What was the nature of Ezekiel 16 when we looked at it? Remember we had to summarize because of how explicit it was? Yeah. We couldn't even read it in the original because it was so graphic. Well, 23 is in that same vein. Super graphic. 16 and 23 are the most explicit chapters in the Bible. When it comes to just the language, the imagery that Ezekiel's portraying is meant to shock the reader, or the hearer in his case, because they would have been like, this is just so not appropriate, Ezekiel, and that's the whole point, is it's not appropriate because what you're doing, Israel, is not appropriate. See, so there's purpose behind it, but I'm going to have a few things summarized in 23 because of that, just so that we can kind of zip through it. So obviously Ezekiel 16, when we went through that, it was talking about the adulterous wife, remember? And the whole falling away into idolatry and other gods and all of the things that they were doing. And interestingly, that was kind of more directed to, I guess you could say maybe the nation as a whole to some degree. 23 is really more talking about the political falling away. So not only did you have this moral collapse in society, but then you also had this political collapse in Israel, where what they were doing and how they were conducting themselves with the nations was not okay. And so God kind of uses imagery that's similar to speak to both. So 16 is more, what have you done, in your hearts to me? And then in 23, it's the same, but it's directed more at what have you done politically with the nation? How have you destroyed it politically? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. So I'm going to summarize a little bit of it. If you want to go read it on your own, you can. They've tried to lighten it in the text, even in English, just so you can read it and not feel like totally, but even then you'll get a little bit embarrassed because it's just got some things that'll turn your face a little red. So let's start Ezekiel 23. We'll look at verses 1 through 3. It says, "And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, there were two women, the daughters of one mother, and they prostituted themselves in Egypt in their childhood. They were prostituting themselves there." So here's this intro, and it's these two women, okay, that we're going to get introduced to. In verse 4, he says, "Now as for their names, the older sister Oholah and Oholibah." Strange names, right? That was her sister. "They became mine, and they bore sons and daughters, and their names are Samaria for Oholah and Jerusalem for Oholibah." Now, it's really weird that this is, kind of how God is portraying this, but you have to remember, he's talking about these two sisters, and I would venture to say if this would have been at some point in the past, it might have just been one. Because what happened to Israel? They split, and so you had the northern kingdom and you had the southern kingdom. And God comes in and says, I'm going to talk about them both specifically. And some have actually argued that, okay, God's sending mixed messages here because he's talking about these two sisters. And you notice in this verse, he says, "And they became mine." So it's like he has two wives. So some people go, red flag. God's saying you can have multiple wives. Is that what he's saying here? No, he's using an illustration because of the state of Israel. And you have the northern kingdom, and you have the southern kingdom. And at one time they were together. And that was his, they were his as one, but they've split. And so he's using an illustration as these sisters to make that case that, the split has caused a problem. And now I have it looks like two wives is kind of what it is, but one that's split. So he's given them these weird nicknames, strange nicknames. And they're fictitious names. They're like pet names to some degree. Okay, I'm going to give you a pet name, and it's with purpose. So Oholah and Oholibah, so they both contain this beginning phrase. You can see it right there in the wording, and it literally means tent. So he's calling them tents to some degree. And they have a little bit of specifics to them. So this one is her own tent. The Oholah means her own tent. And this would be Samaria. Now, can you guess what this one's going to be? Jerusalem. And it literally means my tent within her. So now let's think about that from just a geographical standpoint. Where does God dwell in Israel? So he's probably talking about the temple. He has his dwelling place in the midst of Jerusalem. And so his nickname for her is different than Samaria because that's not where he dwells. He doesn't dwell in Samaria. He dwells in Jerusalem. And so the name, that's her tent, but this is Jerusalem. It's her, but this is where my tent is. So he's making a distinction there of these two groups, the two places. Now, if you think about it from a historical standpoint, the people were always supposed to come to Jerusalem, right? Why did they end up staying in the north at times? What happened? Do you remember what happened in the history of Israel where they quit coming to Jerusalem to spend time with God? So Jeroboam comes in and he says, you guys don't need to go down to Jerusalem. You can just come up here in the north, and he set up these giant bull altars where he said you could come and worship Yahweh at the bull altar. And so what was he afraid of? He was afraid that people would go to the south and they would stay there, and then he would lose his power in the north. And so you had these political problems that led to apostasy. They led to disobedience to what God wanted, because God wanted people to come to Jerusalem. And they made ways in the leadership, altered that. So the issues here, she's the eldest sister. Remember, she was there first. You have Israel in the north, you have Judah in the south. And she's not doing what she should be doing. In fact, she was conquered years before Israel, or I guess I should say Judah was conquered during Ezekiel's day. She's been gone for a while. But she was the eldest. And when you go through the chapter, Ezekiel only, I could say, scolds her for 6 verses. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but scolds her for 6 verses. But Jerusalem, the younger sister, gets 35. Why does Jerusalem get hammered so much more than Samaria? I mean, the obvious one would be this is where God dwells. So I'm going to have a little bit more to say about, where I'm at, where the priests are and all this stuff. But they both do get it. So neither one of them gets away, but Jerusalem just gets a whole lot more attention, interestingly. So let's talk about the charge against Samaria, okay, the eldest sister. Here's some verses in Ezekiel 23. And Oholah prostituted herself while she was still mine, and she lusted for her lovers, for Assyria, who was nearby, clothed in blue cloth, governors and prefects, handsome young men, and all of them horsemen, experts on horseback. And her whorings from the time of Egypt she did not abandon, for they slept with her in her childhood. Kind of a weird phrase, but he's talking specifically about Samaria in the north, okay? Israel in the north. And they've always been a problem, because he even makes the case here, what was the issue with Egypt? Even when they were young, they were going to Egypt. Egypt was their kind of lover in this illustration. And, what's God's real issue here? Who does he want them to love? Yeah. In other words, when you need protection, don't run to another man. You come to your husband, which is me. And what would they do, though? They'd run all over the place. And he even makes the case here. He's kind of getting back, and you have to think of this again from the political aspect. The leaders of Israel in the north, instead of putting their trust in Yahweh, in God, who are they going to? They love Assyria. Assyria is the big nation. They think they're great. And so what do? They look at all of the bling they have, their military, and they go, wow, look how tough they are. Look how well equipped they are. Look how strong they are. And what does that do? It entices them to maybe we should reach out to Assyria and see if they would make an alliance with us, a treaty with us. Maybe we should see if they'll protect us. And in some cases, the kings went and made these alliances just so they could have protection. And why is that a problem to God? People do it all the time. He wants to be the protector, doesn't he? Do you want to put your life in the hands of another nation? Or do you want to put your country and your life in the hands of me? I think I said this last week. There's a verse that Psalm 118 says, it's better to trust in God than to trust in man. And that's something that we struggle with because we want to make sure that we have these things physical, tangible. There they are. They'll protect us. And God's saying, well, but what about me? Where do I fall into this? And so here you have this, he calls it their lust for their lovers, those that they've just fallen in love with their country, how they look, their cloth, their leaders. They just think they're the best thing ever. And they're really not. They're not. Goes on and says, therefore I gave her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, after whom she lusted. They uncovered her nakedness. They took her sons and her daughters. They killed her with the sword, and she became a name for the women, and they executed judgments against her. This is what's really sad, is they go after another husband, and what do these men do to her? Abuse her. Take the fruit of her labor, and they destroy it. They butcher it. And we've talked about this in the past weeks. It says they uncovered her nakedness. What does that mean? Do you remember? What's that an idiom for? They shamed her, publicly humiliated her. Instead, he's trying to make the case here that this lover you've gone after has not treated you properly. They've taken advantage of you. They've dishonored you. And so why do they keep going? Why don't they go back to their husbands? That's probably God's big question, right? Why don't you stop doing this? Come back to me. And in the end, it actually even says here at the end of that verse, and she became a name for the women. So not only did she become, unfaithful to her husband, but because of her actions with Assyria, the other women are walking around going, ooh, Ula, or whatever her name is, Samaria. Don't call me that. It's like if you named a daughter Jezebel today. Probably wouldn't want to do that, would you? It's got a connotation to it. It's got an evil, type of a thing. In fact, I think they'll even have this phrase they'll use sometimes if a young woman or a woman's being very promiscuous, they'll say, she's got a Jezebel spirit. Have you ever heard that before? Yeah. So you don't want to name somebody Jezebel, right, if they're a girl, or anybody probably. But that's what they're doing. They're saying here is that Israel in the north became a name. That people in Assyria are going, ooh, don't name your kids that. Very dishonoring. So let's talk about Israel's destruction in the north. Well, Samaria in the north was destroyed at the hand of the Assyrians. Surprise, surprise. When you put your hope in another nation and you think they're going to save me, they're going to protect me, they're going to do all this stuff, and they're not God, these in fact are pagan nations, what ultimately ends up happening? They come in and they take over. They abuse, they destroy. And they came in and they defeated Israel in the north. 722 BC. Now, where are we at in Ezekiel in the timeline? Do you remember what date we're at approximately with Ezekiel? We're in the 590s, 580s, right in 570s, right in the end of the 500s. So look how much time has passed between when the north got taken out and when the south actually gets attacked by the Babylonians. There's been, over 100 years has gone by since that happened. Now, you think the South would have said, wonder why that happened in the North. Maybe we should take action so that we don't know. They didn't do that. Let's talk about the charge against, now, the southern sister, okay? Judah, or Jerusalem in this case. Verse 11. And though Oholibah, her sister, saw, so what is her sister looking at? To the north. My older sister, the younger sister's looking to the older sister. Yet, even though she saw what happened, in her lust, she behaved more corruptly than her, and her whoring was more than the prostitution of her sister. They lasted a little longer, Judah, They had some good things take place, some reformations, and Josiah came in and did some good things, and Hezekiah, and they had some of these guys. But ultimately, where did they end up? Even worse than the north. They had started to institute things that they weren't even doing there, and they got taken out by the Assyrians. You think God's trying to say, guys, wake up here. Like, as a nation, think about what's happened. When you think of this kind of from our world today, there's a huge push in our society for this whole socialist, Marxist, government. And it's interesting because if you look at all the different countries that have embraced that, what's happened to them? in history. Has it ever succeeded? It always ends in death and destruction and godlessness and failure. And yet, what are people doing today? They're trying to push it from the highest levels. And I just sometimes read this and I go, oh my goodness, like, just go read Ezekiel. Just go read it. What did they do in the north? They failed, They failed, and what are we doing? Instead of learning from history, what are we doing? We're pushing for it. And I'm fearful that we'll end up, to some degree, like the southern sister, who not only did what the northern one did, but it says in here, she did worse than the north. Went even further. So what are the charges? Well, she went after the Egyptians. So the southern sister says, well, I'm abandoning my husband to go after the Egyptians. And so they made some alliances there to try to get protection. Remember, even with Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar is going to come and Zedekiah's on the throne, what does he try to do? He tries to skirt the whole judgment and says, I'm going to go get the Egyptians and they'll maybe be able to help me get out from under Nebuchadnezzar. And did it work out? No. They came in and they sieged it and he ends up dying and his kids end up dying. It didn't work out. The Assyrians, they actually went after the Assyrians too. So even though they had history to tell them, stay away from these guys, what did they do? They went after the Babylonians too. And it actually talks about even before that, there's all these nations around them that they were somewhat infatuated with. They liked the way they did things. They liked the way they looked. They liked their militaries. And you have to remember, they're just this small, quote, insignificant group there in the middle of nowhere, in between all these places. And it's a miracle that they're still there today, isn't it? Because there's all these places around that just seem like they could come in and take them out real easy. And here they were the same way back then. And so God, I think, did that by design, don't you think? In your weakness, my strength is made perfect. My glory is seen in your weakness. And so what does he do? He puts the weakest group right there. And we've been through how many chapters now where he's like, you guys really are nothing. You're vines that can't hold up anything you're not cedars, you're vines. You're the dross on top of the silver. And he's like, you really are pretty insignificant. In fact, you are insignificant. But because I planted you and I put myself in the midst of you, you became something. You were a queen and you squandered it. And it's a miracle that you're still here. But instead, what did they do? Instead of believing and trusting in that and seeing the beauty in their weakness, what did they do? They said, we got to get stronger. And we can't trust God with it. So they went to all these nations to do it. Verse 19, yet she increased her whorings, recalling the days of her childhood when she prostituted in the land of Egypt. Again, going back in history to, we've always had a little bit of a problem, even in when you were a young nation, with wanting to go after these other suitors, these other nations for your protection. 14 through 16, and she increased her whorings, and she saw men carved on the wall, images of the Chaldeans carved in red, belted with a belt at their waist, with turbans on their heads, all of them giving the appearance of adjutants, the image of the Babylonians. Chaldea was the land of their birth, and she lusted for them where her eyes saw them, and she sent messengers to them at Chaldea. So this is talking about the Babylonians. What did they do in Judah? They said, oh my goodness, look at how wonderful these people are. Look at how they've got this imagery on their walls. When you go into their cities, they're just amazing. We've got to go after these guys. We have to make some kind of treaty. We have to do something. It kind of shows you how the national pride of who they were as established by God in Israel was fading, wasn't it? Instead of being so proud of who God was and how he established them as a people in their land, they started to look at all these other nations and their culture, and what did they do? They were kind of jealous. They were kind of envious, and they kind of wanted that. And is that not happening somewhat today? I mean, what happened to the American culture that was established by the founders, on God and on his work and on his gospel and on, the freedom that he offers. And it's almost trying to be erased, isn't it? It's like they're trying to cut that completely out and embrace every culture. It's all beautiful culture. Bring it in. Does that sound like what they're doing? Therefore, Oholibah, thus says the Lord Yahweh, look, I am stirring up your lovers against you concerning whom you turned away, and I will bring them against you from all around. So the very ones you looked to that you thought were wonderful, what are they going to do? They're going to destroy you. Because you didn't preserve what you were and what you are, which is the children of Yahweh in the land that Yahweh gave you. He is your hope, and you haven't held on to that. And so the very ones you think are going to make you strong, what are they going to do? They're going to take you down. I hope we will read this and wake up at some point as a country. Verse 36 and 37, Yahweh said to me, Son of man, will you judge Oholah and Oholibah and declare their abominable deeds to them? For they committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. Remember that? There's the adultery language again. You've committed adultery. And so he's kind of asking Ezekiel, okay, you get to go and deliver the judgment, right? Poor Ezekiel. Chapter 24, verse 1 and 2, he says, And the word of Yahweh came to me in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, saying, Son of man, write for yourself the name of the day, this very day, the king of Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem on exactly this day. When did that happen? There it is. We know because of the numbers and the dates that they gave us. On January 5th, 587 BC is the date that this happened. That's what he's talking about. And what did they do? This is when they came. Coming in to take the place out. You're not getting out of it. They've committed adultery. It's over. Judgment's right there. So he goes through the sister illustration, and then he changes it to the cauldron. There's all these little parables, and I really think as we've read this, you start to see a lot of Jesus' hand in this, because when he gets into the New Testament, he uses a lot of parables, doesn't he? And it's interesting because they even ask him sometimes, like, why parables? Why do you have to do that? And what does he say? Why does he tell them parables? So there's some that they'll make sense, and others will be like, we don't get it. And it's like a dividing line. He also makes the case, if I really told you all the spiritual things, you wouldn't understand any of it. So I'm going to give you illustrations that you can make sense with things that are around you, common things that you interact with, so you can say, I understand. So Jesus does that a lot when he's using his parables of different things. Think about the pearl and the manager and all these, the vineyard, you have all these parables. This is just the Old Testament version of that kind of. Ezekiel gets to be that guy, deliver these things.
Well, when David sinned, Nathan came to him with
a parable.
Parable.
Yeah.
And several times in David's life, someone came to him with this, just to make a point, and he got it.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, when the lights clicked on, it was like, even Nathan says, you're that man. You're the one who took and killed that one guy's poor, little sheep, little lamb, So he uses this illustration of the cauldron. It's a proverb. He's even instructed, okay, you're going to tell him another proverb, and we're going to use a cooking illustration. So God's changed hats. He's put the chef hat on. We're going to use a cooking illustration. And the way it's presented is like God is preparing a meal for a big banquet, like a big party, kind of like a big guest, book invitation. And here's what it says. Deliver a proverb to the rebellious house, and you must say to them, Thus says the Lord Yahweh, place the pot, place it and also pour water into it. Gather its pieces to it, every good piece, thigh and shoulder. Fill it with choice bones. Take the choicest of the flock, and also pile the bones under it. Boil it vigorously. Indeed, its bones boiled in the midst of it. So he's kind of preparing. Imagine this guy getting a pot, and he's got the best meat you can cut. Filet mignon, ready? You wouldn't boil that probably, grill it. But he's getting the best cuts, and he's putting it into his pot, and he's getting ready to cook a meal. So the language in these particular verses, if you read it in some variations of how they've written, and Ezekiel's written this in Hebrew, you kind of read like place the pot and the thigh and the shoulder, but there's more to it when you read it. The meal is really geared in the language as extravagant. This isn't just a normal meal. This is an extravagant meal. It's cooked with the best cooking ware, and it's the best food that's being prepared, the best meat that you can get, the best parts of the animal. The cooking pot, it just says pot, but it's actually a word that is altered to be a very expensive one. To think of in this day, what did you want to cook? If you were just an average person in the nation, what did you use? Probably a clay pot. You didn't have, metal, copper, these things were high-end stuff. If you want the really high-end cookware, this is the stuff. And that's what he's using. Copper was for the rich, clay was for the poor. He's going to tell us about this copper pot that he's cooking in. So it's the best. It's the best stuff. This meal may have actually been a banquet. It's kind of relayed in such a way that this would not be a normal meal for anybody. It's a banquet for a king. Or in some cases, this may have been a meal prepared in the temple for the priests. So it's for the best. It's for the top people. So he uses this cooking pot language before. Remember this, and back in Ezekiel 11? We talked about this. It says, by the sword you will fall at the border of Israel. I will judge you, and you will know that I am Yahweh. It will not be as a pot to you. Now, the illustration here was you guys are looking to save yourself by hopping in this. You think you're in like this metal pot, and no one's going to get in. It was not the same usage, but he used the cooking again. This way it was to protect the food, keep the food safe. In verse 6 he says, therefore thus says the Lord Yahweh, woe to the city of blood guilt, a pot that has its rust in it. Its rust did not go out from it. Bring it out piece by piece. One is as good as another. Now he just goes from like, we're preparing the meal to, oh, by the way, woe to the city, the blood guilt, this pot's got rust in it, we've got this problem. He makes the case one is as good as another. That's kind of a strange way of translating it because it literally means no lot has fallen on it. It's kind of an interesting phrase. But what is he saying? There's nothing special about these pieces of meat now. When they would cast lots, what was the idea? Remember we talked about this a couple weeks ago.
Making decisions.
You throw this thing out there and who directs how it lands? God does. And what is he saying here about the meat? There's nothing special here. It's not divinely chosen. Now, why is that significant to the people that are sitting there before Ezekiel? He's there in Babylon. He's got the elders before him, and they're going, we're the people of God. We're the chosen ones. Nothing's going to happen to us. And here he comes in with this language, one's just as good as the other. You guys are not anything special with what you've been doing. Now, the nation itself is special, but don't think that me choosing you is protecting you from what's going to happen, because that's probably what they thought. One's as good as another. And chapter 16 of Ezekiel 33 says the lot. Oh, actually, this should be Proverbs. Sorry, it's Proverbs 16:33, not Ezekiel. The lot will be cast into the lap, but all of its decisions are from Yahweh. This is just the common belief. We think it's crazy. It's just random chance. That's not how they thought of it. It was God directed. So this one is good as another. What is Ezekiel implying about the meat in the pot? It's just, it's the choicest cuts, but don't think that it's somehow divinely protected, divinely specific, chosen. What would that mean if the meat represents the people of Israel? If you're sitting there before Ezekiel and you go, uh-oh.
Chopped liver.
Yeah, we're chopped liver. Yeah, that's exactly right. Look what he says here. For her blood was in the midst of her. She put it on a bare rock. She did not pour it on the ground to cover it with dust. To stir up rage, to avenge myself through vengeance, I placed its blood on the barrenness of a rock so that it may not be covered. This is a weird verse. What in the world is he talking about here? We went from meat to now we're something about blood poured on rocks and weird stuff, right? This might help a little. Got to go all the way back to Leviticus. Now remember, Ezekiel's a priest. He knows the priesthood. He knows the requirements. And so do these people who are probably sitting right before him, the elders. Here's what it says in Leviticus 17. And if there is anyone from the house of Israel or from the alien who is dwelling in the midst who eats any blood, then I will set my face against the person who eats the blood, and I will cut him off from among his people. Indeed, the flesh's life is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives, because it is the blood with the life that makes atonement. Therefore I said to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may the alien who is dwelling in your midst eat blood. What's the restriction? Don't eat blood. Right? Sorry for you who like the rare steaks. Okay, if anyone from the Israelites or from the alien who is dwelling in the midst who hunts a wild game animal or a bird that may be eaten, then he shall pour out its blood, and he shall cover it with the soil. Indeed, the life of all flesh, its blood, is in its life. So I said to the Israelites, you may not eat the blood of any flesh, because the life of all flesh is its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. So what is he saying about this meat? He's got this cauldron. He's put the choice cuts in there. And then what does he lament about? Still got the blood in it. And what are you supposed to do with that? It's supposed to be gone. It's supposed to be poured out. And it's not. It's not clean. And so when Israel represents the meat, what is he saying? You're not in the state you should be in. There's a problem with the meat. It's got blood in it. And what were they supposed to do? I mean, under Levitical law, you had to make sure there was no blood in it, right? And if you did pour out the blood, you were supposed to bury the blood. Remember this one? Right after they came out of the ark? Every moving thing that lives shall be for you as food, as I gave the green plants to you. I now give you everything. Only you shall not eat raw flesh with blood in it. There's something about this whole blood thing that God seems to be offended by. You know, what's the deal? There was an association here. I mean, the blood piece is precious. You know, God makes the case many times that blood is a precious thing. It's the life is in the blood. There's no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. Blood's really important to God. It has a symbolic nature. In other words, here's what he's saying. Israel is no longer kosher. This meat that I've got prepared is no longer suitable for eating. And Ezekiel and the leaders probably would have known that as he's relaying this, because it's like, we got a problem. There's blood in the meat. It's not clean. It's not kosher. Is that the state Israel's in at the time of the judgment? They're sinful. You know, they've embraced idolatry. They're not clean anymore. You know, they're not kosher before God as a people. So now this might make a little more sense. For her blood was in the midst of her, she put it on a bare rock. Why is that a problem? What were they supposed to do with the blood when they poured it out? They were supposed to bury it, and what did they do? And what they did shed or pour out, they just laid out there. You didn't finish it. And so it's kind of exposed. Look at this one. Now again, if you're hunting wild game, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to pour out its blood, cover it with soil. It sounds really weird. Like, it doesn't sound like, okay, why do I have to do this? It just seems very strange. Why does something like blood have to be buried? Why can't it just be left? Okay. Yeah, it had to be covered. It couldn't be just blood exposed. That's the point.
She did not pour.
She did not. That's right.
Okay.
She didn't do what she was supposed to do with it. Now look at this in Genesis 4:10. This is one of the earliest stories. Cain and Abel, and he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." Isn't that interesting? Cain kills Abel, and he probably didn't take the time to clean it up and do what was honorable and what was right to show respect. He just slaughters him and leaves him. And what does God say? It's like the blood sitting there is a reminder to God that there's justice that has to be met. I think it could be. I think that the overarching thing is that the preciousness of blood is something that's supposed to be inside. I mean, it's supposed to be inside your body. It's not supposed to be exposed in that sense of, it's very symbolic for disrespect, injustice, the improperness of how you deal with a kill or someone that has died. You do these things in a way to show respect for what God has given. God's the one who gave the blood. So what should we do with it? He says we should cover it up. We should bury it. And I wonder as I've read through this, if it's because if it's not covered up, what does God say? It's crying out to me. Something is left not right here. Okay? In fact, he goes on to say, your lifeblood I will acquire from every animal, I will acquire it, and from the hand of humankind, from the hand of each man to his brother, I will require the life of humankind. As for the one shedding the blood of humankind, by humankind his blood shall be shed. You know, this is the whole idea of, if you commit murder, if you're doing these things, wrongfully, you're going to have to pay for it. God's going to hold you accountable. God made humankind in his own image. That's the key. I made man in my image. And when he gets slaughtered or treated improperly or it's not properly handled, it's an abomination to some degree. It's detestable. It's disrespectful. Look at Job. Remember Job? He's in this terrible state. He's getting, all these terrible things. And he laments at one point. He says, my face is red because of weeping, and deep shadows are on my eyelids, although violence is not on my hands. I didn't do anything wrong, but all this bad stuff's happened to me. And then he says, and my prayer is pure. O earth, you should not cover my blood. What a weird statement. What is he saying by saying that? What's he trying to relay to the people? That the injustice that would be buried if my blood disappeared, I want it exposed so that God will always see the injustice that I'm experiencing in this. In other words, I need to be made right. And when the blood is exposed, the work is not done. There's still a reminder here that something needs to be fixed or corrected. So Job says, please don't bury my blood, right? And he goes, so now look, my witness is in the heavens, and he who vouches for me is on the heights. He'll see it and know I got to still do something to correct this. It's not buried. It's not complete. It's not finished. So Job understood the concept that if the blood is exposed, there's still something that has to be done. It's not been properly handled the way it should have. It's a reminder to God. To Israel, the sanctity of life was of no value in their nation anymore. That's what he's trying to relay here, is they have gone to such a degree that the life of individuals, the blood, has become, you can just pour it out and leave it exposed. They didn't treat it with respect and dignity. They didn't care. So it's really a sanctity of life issue. You're exposed because you have this blood in you. The blood that you were supposed to take care of so you are clean and pure and kosher, you still have with you. You've disrespected my image. You don't value life. They were spilling blood, leaving it exposed to show off is the connotation in this, is that other nations would look and say, oh, it was for a purpose to relay their own power, their own ability. Many have referred to the child sacrifice that was taking place in Israel at this time. They would slaughter their kids. You think about Cain and Abel. Abel's innocent. He gets killed by Cain, and God says, the blood of your brother is crying out from the ground to me. What happens when you've got babies that are now being sacrificed to Molech and the Baal and these other things, and they're just slaughtering them? They've completely lost any value for life. And God says, the blood is crying out to me. That's a little scary when you think of our country. Does God not sit up there and go, the blood is crying out from the ground? The decency and respect for life, as given by its author Yahweh, was gone. And when that happens, what happens to a society? Everything becomes permissible. Anything anybody wants to do is fine, because it doesn't matter if I hurt somebody else. They're just another human being. They're not valuable. Their life doesn't matter. And so all of these things that would have been I'm not going to do that because that person is valuable and they could get hurt. What happens in a society when we don't value the person anymore? We do everything terrible and people get hurt. And it just gets worse because there's no value for human life. And in a roundabout way, that's what God is telling them. You have lost the sacredness of human life that you once held. That does sound familiar. Verses 9 through 11, therefore says the Lord Yahweh, woe to the city of blood guilt. Even I will make the pile of wood great. In other words, now go back to the cooking thing. We're not going to have a few boards. We're going to make a giant fire here. Pile up the logs, kindle the fire, finish cooking the meat, and mix in the spices. Let the bones be burned, and make it stand empty upon its burning coals, so that it may become hot, and its copper may become molten, and be melted in the midst of it, so that its uncleanliness and its rust be consumed. So God's going, instead of cooking this a little bit for a wonderful meal, what's he decided to do? It's spoiled meat that's not clean, and so the only thing left to do is what? Burn it up and dump it out. There's a rust problem in these verses. Copper doesn't rust. Scholars read this and they go, it's not an iron pot, it's a copper pot. So how does the rust factor come in? Why is there rust involved in this? And so the usage in 24 has caused some problem because of this. And yet the pot is associated with being rusty. Now, interestingly, there's a variation in the Hebrew word for rust that could literally mean it's diseased or it's sick. So it may not actually be talking about the pot. It might be talking about the meat. What's wrong with the meat in the pot? It has blood in it, and it also has got rust, which isn't the rust like we're thinking. It's meaning it's diseased. It's sick. And so should anyone consume this meat? So what's it good for? Burn it up. Throw it out. Its copper may become molten, be melted in the midst of it, so that its uncleanliness and its rust be consumed. It's worth nothing at this point because of the state of the meat. The meat is not good meat anymore, even though it was the choice cuts. So what's he doing? He's consuming it. Through effort she has caused weariness. Its thick rust went out, not out of it. Its rust. Into the fire with its rust. In your uncleanliness and obscene conduct, because I cleansed you, but you were not clean from your uncleanliness, you will not be clean again until I fully vent my rage on you. I, Yahweh, have spoken. It is coming, and I did it. I will not disregard, and I will not take pity, and I will not reconsider. According to your ways and according to your deeds, they will judge you, declares the Lord Yahweh. When God has had enough, he's had enough. And he's done everything he can. And he's realized that I have this spoiled meat that unfortunately is not good for anything. It can't be consumed. And so what's the thing we have to do with it? Burn it up. And so what happens to Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar? They come in and they destroy the place. All the good meat's been removed. It's been taken, a lot of them have been taken into exile. The Ezekiels, the Daniels. God took them out, this remnant group. But the city and the nation itself, right there at home in Jerusalem, has become nothing of value at that point. It's time to be judged. And that's what they got. Interesting illustrations, the sisters and the cauldron. But did you get the whole message? Do you get the message that God's trying to get across to them? They have a lot of problems, and it all begins in the heart, doesn't it? All begins right there in the individual heart. Because so the heart goes, so the nation goes. In fact, I was just talking to Butch about this. We were just talking about this, right before class of, they have graduation today. And they used to do it on Saturdays. Now they do it on a Sunday. And we were like, why do they do that? Sunday's a day for church. And you could come in and you could make a rule and say, you know what, none on Sunday more. We're not doing graduation on Sunday. But what's the heart of the people? Well, how do you return a sacredness in our hearts to Sunday or to the Sabbath day or to the day of worship? It has to happen inside. And then people will naturally say, we're not doing it on Sunday because that's the day that we worship. But when a society neglects those things and starts to have hearts that become calloused and secular, the things that are sacred start to become just common, right? Isn't that what happened with Israel? Life that was so sacred just became, it's just another thing, pour it out, who cares? How do we change? How do we get back there? How do you get a nation that used to have Sundays closed where nothing was open? We were just talking about that. How do you get back to that? You can't come in and just make a law because you can't legislate morality. It doesn't work. What has to happen? The top levels have to come in and reinstill a moral sense of the goodness of God and the sacredness and the holiness of God and the honor of God. And it has to begin and permeate the country. And then guess what will happen? People will say, we should be a church on Sunday, or we should worship together on this day, and so we are not going to do it. It's reserved for God. You can't legislate that. Can't do it. It's the heart has to change. And that's what God wants here. And as we're going through this, we've got little tidbits of it as we've gone through, but what's God's ultimate plan as he's kind of sprinkled the breadcrumbs in Ezekiel? What's he going to do eventually? I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to give you a new spirit. And it's going to be different this time. Things are going to change inside, internally. And when that happens, what's going to happen to the outside? Things are going to change, should change. That's the key, is getting hearts to change so that everything else will be impacted. And that's what God really wanted from the people, is their internal hearts and their minds to be changed. So that's where we're going to stop for today.